Great. So yes, I'm going to talk about Thinopyrum intermedium, also known as intermediate wheatgrass, and also known as, we've been selling the grain under a trade name called Kernza, because it's hard to market something that's called intermediate wheatgrass. I'm going to try to go over really briefly the kind of the state of the work that we've been up to and show a little bit how that might fit into the proposed project. So here's what I want to cover today. First of all, the background of why should we domesticate or develop these new perennial grain crops, and why particularly Thinopyrum intermedium, and then how we've been doing it so far, and what things are we looking at to accelerate that process. So background is me growing up on a farm, and I spent a lot of time on a tractor just like this. This is my dad driving through the field. Spent hundreds of hours tilling up the soil to prepare for planting or after we've harvested. And this is kind of an essential part of agriculture for thousands of years, is this process of clearing ground and planting the seed that you want, especially for annual grain crops. And the results have been disastrous many times. This is northern China, a very profound area of soil destruction, but throughout the world we're losing soil on an unsustainable basis, which will inevitably undermine our agriculture. There's a nice quote here about civilizations depending on their soil quality, and as those soils decline, those civilizations are vulnerable. Recently we've been able to kind of come in with fertilizers and keep things going, but even that's going to have an end, and it also has a large cost to it of subsidizing. And what I like to point out is that often we have movements of sustainable agriculture that focus on, oh, we have local food, we need to have organic food, and we need to use traditional heirloom crops. These kinds of things are presented as major solutions, but the agriculture of the past collapsed, even when it was all fitting into these categories that we consider to be sustainable. So it's actually inherently this process of tillage and preparation for planting that threatens agriculture more than, say, using GMOs or not using organic production systems. We like to talk about the ecological framework to think about agriculture, and this is a famous volcano in the United States that erupted when I was a kid, Mount St. Helens. And people talked a lot about what happened over time as the land was suddenly cleared, and then over time annual plants came in, and longer-lived plants, a process of succession that we're all aware of as an ecological concept, applies to agriculture as well. So on an annual basis, we go in and make sure that all plant life is eradicated from that land before we plant. And that might be done with no-till nowadays, chemically, or by tillage. No matter how we're doing it, we're sort of resetting that ground to zero, and we have to start back with early invaders of that space, which is great for annual grain crops, because that's where those plants came from. They were very niche plants that could go into a place after there was a big disturbance. They're not well suited to building soil over time, so they don't persist in nature typically. But if we could have an agriculture that would use plants like that, we could actually build soil instead of degrading soil. And so this is kind of what it looks like where I come from. The below ground portion of these plants is enormous, and this is the engine that's transporting carbon below ground and driving the soil biota that gives us deep, rich, healthy soils that our agriculture has depended on now. And that soil carbon, which comes from the atmosphere, moves into the soil, drives all these cycles in the soil that makes us a living, healthy soil. As we go to these annual crops, the most profound thing is over time is soil erosion. This is actually a no-till farm in Iowa with catastrophic erosion. When you get 9 inches of rain, soil goes away, and it doesn't matter if you're doing no-till or not. You're going to lose a lot of soil. Another thing that we see is nitrogen moving off of the landscape. So one of the major things that we do with annual grain agriculture is to provide a lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. That's been moving off our agricultural landscapes into ground and surface waters. Where I come from in the Midwest United States, wells are becoming poisoned with nitrogen fertilizer at a very high rate. People are going to extreme measures to try to make the water drinkable again. This is just a picture showing how many regions of the Earth's oceans are now poisoned with nitrogen fertilizers, mostly moving out of our agricultural systems and causing the death of large marine life. So one of the things that we know is that a deep root system in the soil year-round takes up nitrogen very, very efficiently. This is intermediate wheatgrass in this picture. I don't know how this button might work. A small dot. So the bottom is intermediate wheatgrass, and the top is wheat under conventional and organic systems. Organic system had less nitrogen loss over time, but the perennial in any system was able to bring the nitrogen loss down to near zero by the end of the first year of the study. After that, basically have no nitrogen leaching through that system anymore. So yeah, it's obviously those big deep roots. Once nitrogen over here gets down below those roots, or especially during different times of the year. So often our annual grain crop systems, we have 9 months of the year where there's essentially no living roots in that system, but there's water moving through, and that's where the nitrogen escapes from us. We lose about 50% of the nitrogen applied to annual grain crops, either into the air or to the soil water. Okay, so total root biomass in perennials is much, much larger. This is a comparison of intermediate wheatgrass with wheat. So what effect does that have on carbon in the atmosphere? We've had an eddy covariance tower installed in one of our intermediate wheatgrass fields over a period of several years, to be able to measure the net movement of CO2 either out of the soil or into the soil and crop. And so over time, we had quite large net uptake, but respiration is also increasing. So what's happening is roots were being built up in the soil, and eventually they'll start decomposing and coming back into the atmosphere. But if we look at change in greenhouse gases, there's a potential there to pull a lot of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere very quickly into the bodies of those plants and into the soil roots. How much of that's getting to soil carbon is another question for long-term storage. But if we were able to pull up a lot of that, and we planted perennials all over the planet, we would have a very rapid sequestration effect just into the perennial plants themselves. Often it's talked about with planting trees in forests. So this is a comparison of how much is actually going into the soil in a field that's 16 years old of intermediate wheatgrass. And we see about 1 ton per hectare per year, which is pretty typical for perennials being established on annual cropland. Okay, so I just talked at a soil carbon sequestration meeting last week, so I made this slide just to kind of give us an idea of what's the potential for mitigation using perennial grains or perennial crops in general. And this is my back of the plant breeders envelope calculations. Basically, when we went from annuals to perennials, people say we lost somewhere between 40 to 80 gigatons of carbon out of our soils. So there's potential to return that much back into the soil. And you can kind of see from this diagram how large that would be relative to the other stocks that are out there. Basically we could do 0.5 to 1 gigatons of carbon per year on our agricultural soils, which is not trivial, but it's also not the single solution to our problems. Okay, so this intermediate wheatgrass, I just wanted to kind of put things in context of how long we've been at this. The Rodale Institute really started this work in the 1980s by selecting intermediate wheatgrass out of about 100 different species of perennial grasses. That's one that they thought was amenable to domestication. They did breeding for about 10 years, from 1990 to 2000. I picked up the material from about 2001, 2002 until today. and really began to collaborate with people at other institutions around 2010. So in that 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, it was basically just me working at the Land Institute on this crop. Everything that's happened since then has been over the last 10 years. We have collaborations now around the country and in other countries as well. In 2017 was the first product made out of this grain on a very small scale. Okay, one of the reasons that I liked this crop was that it was actually fairly easy to grow. Farmers could do it with conventional equipment. They just drive their combine over it and get a combine bin full of grain. We didn't need any special changes, and there's growers already producing seed for forage uses. There's a huge biomass production, and our economic analyses have shown that if we use that forage residue after the grain harvest, and as well as do some grazing in the spring or fall, the economics of the system can work out even with relatively low yields, because you can pretty well cover your costs with that forage part, and then whatever you make in grain is your profit essentially on top of that. We found that we could put it into bread products. So a well-known baker in Kansas showing off what he thought was a really good loaf, one of the first loaves made with perennial intermediate wheatgrass in Kansas anyway. And as I mentioned, we started to have people trying to make it and put it into beers, and that's a nice thing to do because it's a very standardized product that is not very influenced by the characteristics of the grain that's going in, as long as it's at a 20% level. Not a big deal. So we've had numerous beers made at breweries around the United States so far, often a small run thing, one batch, and nowadays you can make up some cans and have it run within 3 months. They've made this North Cold beer and did a one run, and it was all sold within about 6 months. So it's a great way to raise awareness of the crop. You use it really well to make noodles. There's a noodle making company in Minnesota. You can make cookies and things, but very good properties, just like conventional wheat in terms of something like a cookie. Breads have to be blended with wheat, or you can make a very dense kind of German-style rye loaf with it. So these are 100%, and you see the effect of just 100% kernels of grain. At 20% blends, it looks a lot more like these, very, very, very similar. In terms of quality, I put this up to show the diversity within the species. So this is, I'm not going to explain this in great detail, but the area under this curve gives you some estimate of mixing quality of the grain. And what we saw with screening a whole bunch of plants is that we have everything from better than wheat to much, much worse than wheat, but the average is much, much worse. So there's pretty much anything we want to breed for, we can find diversity within the species for it. So people ask me, is it hard or red or white or winter? Like what kind of wheat is it like? Well, it's more diverse than wheat, much, much more diverse than wheat. So we have a lot of market classes of wheat. We could probably have dozens of market classes of intermediate wheatgrass if we wanted to develop them. So we're doing some work to try to select these higher mixing quality types. Farmers are really excited about it. We get calls from all over the country. This is just a map of all the farmers who have called us up asking for seed. We've got about 100 and some farmers currently growing it. Most of those are pretty small, and looking forward, we want to have a minimum size, about 50 acres maybe, that we don't have farmers just growing 5 or 10 acres. That is a lot of trouble to try to help them to learn how to grow it, and yet they're not going to make any money on 5 acres either. Okay, so what I started with was basically saying, let's do domestication the way domestication was done, except with a scientific twist to it. So instead of accidentally making progress over hundreds of years, we're going to be very deliberate about it, select the best plants, intermate them, and plant them back again over and over and over as fast as we can. And that's what I've been at, really, for the last 17 years. What we need to do with this is what we did with wheat and other crops, is shift the biomass from leaves and stems and maybe roots into harvestable grain. We don't have to make it up from nowhere. So the perennial here, you can see side by side makes a lot more biomass than wheat does in this experiment that we had in Michigan. The issue is we got too many leaves and stems and not enough seed. So it's great that we don't have to be alchemist or something and come up with something from nowhere. We just have to reallocate what we already have. And we've had a good track record of doing that with our other grain crops. We've just continued to select for yield. I suddenly started to find non-shattering plants. So I didn't even deliberately screen for non-shattering. One year I just found my first non-shattering plant and continued to select, and now we have these two plants. Basically, I took the heads and whacked them on the table a few times and then laid them out side by side for you to see the difference in how much shattering we have. So that's essentially we have it. The genetic control is a lot more complicated than I hoped. It's a lot of genes involved, not just one. So getting consistently non-shattering plants in a wild outcrossing polyploid species is taking some time. The change in seed size has been very dramatic. In a good environment, the seeds will be 15 milligrams per seed or so, and when I started it was about 5 for our better ones. So at least doubling, almost tripling seed size potential. But if you get in a stressful environment, the plant is really happy to start making small seeds. So you can still grow plants that end up with very small seeds if they're at all stressed. So last summer I had an evaluation of my first 5 breeding cycles in the field. This is for a few different traits. These were actually grown more in an agronomic environment, so we had solid seeded or rows of them in the field, and it's not individual plants or something. And you can see that grain yield over time has more than doubled over these 5 cycles, which took me somewhere in the range of 12, 13 years to cover those 5 cycles. So more than doubling in 10 years is pretty good, but I'd still like to go a lot faster than that. So about 6, 7 years ago, we started a program for genome sequencing of the species, partnered with JGI in the United States, got a grant from the Department of Energy, and initially just started figuring out, can we do it, how much is it going to cost, and got some genome sequence, and now we're using that in our breeding program. I'll show you a little bit about what that means. So one of the things we do now is genomic selection. The last several cycles have been completely genomic selection based, which is sort of like this diagram. The idea here is that you can run your breeding cycle in 1 year using seedlings, selection on those seedlings, turning them around quickly, but we're developing a model on multiple years in the field. So if we were to do this by traditional breeding, it would take maybe 4 or 5 years per cycle, and we can get 1 cycle done in every year. So this, we think, is probably doubling or tripling our rate of progress. This is what it looks like in the greenhouse. So we basically tag every single plant in there, take a little bit of DNA, extract it, and then predict how that plant will perform if it's growing up in the field. I should have put in a nice slide right there showing our prediction models, but we get really good predictions on a single year in location, and over 90%, but as you go to multiple years in locations, it gets down to more like 50% prediction accuracy. Other things we've been doing is trying to understand the genetic control of traits. This is a graduate student from the University of Minnesota. She's going to defend her thesis in a couple weeks here. I managed to pull a slide from her, data that she's putting in her thesis right now. So this is a GWAS analysis of threshability. So the ability for the seed to come free of the hulls, like most of our modern grains, that can be threshed, like wheat anyway, can be threshed freely without special processing. This is exciting to see. One location of the genome that had a big hit for this. Usually we've done other QTL studies and we find 15, 20 QTLs for every trait, and that'll control 1 or 2%. This one's a larger one, and it's not actually where we don't really know of any candidate gene that's there. And so it's interesting. There's things probably going on in the species that are a little different than our annual crops, but often with QTL studies we find that there's good candidate genes around most of those QTLs we find that are the known genes that control those traits in annual grain crops. Okay, Another approach to this would be, what if we used annual wheat? Since we already have the genes that we know for yield and seed size and threshability and non-shattering, those are already present in our annual grain crops. If we could make a cross between those, we could bring in that trait. So it's the opposite of knocking it out. Maybe we can bring it in, especially for dominant things. And so I put up here is height. Often is a dominant gene control. The dwarfing gene is often dominant. So maybe we can bring in just a chromosome or a piece of a chromosome from wheat and bring that trait, which we're having a hard time finding in the wild species directly. So a few years back, I actually started an effort to do that. We've been developing perennial wheat at the Land Institute for a long time, which is kind of a combination of wheat and perennial grasses, where you often have a similar number of chromosomes of both of those species. This is the idea. We took some of those perennial wheat lines that have all the intermediate wheatgrass chromosomes plus all the durum wheat chromosomes and crossed them back to the intermediate wheatgrass. It was very difficult to make the cross that direction with wheatgrass as the female, but I got a handful of embryo rescued plants. And then, as you see, occasionally you can find a seed on those if you cross them again to intermediate wheatgrass. So often you get one seed on every few plants. So it's difficult work at the beginning, but then you start to restore fertility over time. Now we're able to actually look at what we have very easily. When I first started this work, there was no way affordably to screen hundreds or thousands of plants for which chromosomes were in them. We were longing for that ability, and now we can screen thousands of plants affordably. And this is just showing how many reads we got on each chromosome, essentially. So these are all the intermediate wheatgrass chromosome arms over here. They're all present, and then we see that some wheat chromosomes are lost and some are retained over here. What I'm doing right now is trying to get down to a bunch of plants like this. So I'm trying to get a series of additions where I'll have each intermediate wheatgrass plant with one wheat chromosome added to it, so we can start determining is there anything of particular value coming from each one of these wheat chromosomes when it's in this intermediate wheatgrass background. Don't really have a whole lot of results on that yet. We got to first establish them and then look at them in the field, but there's definitely some interesting phenotypes there. They look very much like intermediate wheatgrass. Overall, they don't look very wheat-like. Once you start losing wheat chromosomes, the wheat appearance tends to go away. So it becomes a lot like wheatgrass again, but hopefully we can get some reduced height or some other important traits. All right, then I want to come up to the idea that Michael, I think he was going to talk about maybe right after this, but maybe we're going to go to something else. But we'll get back to it, I think, in this conference, thinking about what might we do with intermediate wheatgrass. We had a paper reviewing this idea just coming out last week. So here the idea is, can we use our understanding of the wheat genome, which has been published multiple times, is just coming out and makes a big splash every time. It's a good business to be in, actually. So if we can identify genes, domestication genes in wheat or rice or barley or any of these grasses, then we can use that knowledge to target those same genes in intermediate wheatgrass and make a change that will give us perhaps that phenotype we're looking for. All right, so that's a brief overview. I don't know if I have any time for questions or discussion at this moment. Happy to go into a lot of this at much greater detail if anyone wants to. I would mention if travel is allowed in June, you're all invited to a conference that we're having, a 2-day conference in Kansas, where we'll dig into this work in more detail. This has been going on every year now. Between 50 to 100 people typically are able to come and talk about their work in intermediate wheatgrass development. And that includes agronomy as well. I didn't talk about any of the agronomy stuff today, but learning how to manage it in the field. Can you cut the forage? At what time should it be harvested? What planting arrangement should we use? What kind of fertilizer applications should we use? A lot of that work going on. Also a lot of ecosystem services sort of evaluation going on. So the buyers, people who are looking at putting it into products, One of those being General Mills in the United States is wanting to make a product, and we're just waiting on enough production from the farms to make the first run of a cereal that can be sold in stores. And those buyers particularly interested in things like carbon sequestration in the soil and reduction of nitrogen into ground and surface water. So putting some numbers to those things that we know are happening, but we don't know exactly how much. It's very important for people who are going to make a product and want to make some claim on the package about what it's doing. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you very much. So, open for discussion. Yeah?
Yes.
Very nice. Thank you, Lee. Very nice presentation and exciting area of research. I was curious about your GWAS you showed for the chromosome 5 QTL.
Yeah.
I wondered whether what's the level of genome collinearity between your species and wheat, for instance? If 5 refers to homologous group 5, then is this...
It doesn't, yeah. So
Q locus or?
yeah, so we numbered the chromosomes back before we knew which genome they were from. Since that time, we've been able to sort the 21 chromosomes into each 7 from the genome that they originated from by sequencing the possible progenitors. We were able to sort those out. So we've renumbered those chromosomes by genome, but until the genome paper comes out, we're not using that designation yet. So that 5 was actually 2 in wheat and barley. And there's good collinearity across those. We've got some publications lining them up, say barley, and there's maybe an obvious translocation here or there, but not much. It's pretty good. And I'm not aware of anything on 2. Are you aware of group 2 for, the Q is not there.
No, but it's on 2H is the... sorry. I don't remember I always forget the chromosome location, but the brittleness genes in barley, are they on 2?
I don't think so, but I could be wrong. And this is free threshing, not shatter resistant.
It's definitely different mechanism.
Yeah.
We have a question from the virtual audience.
All right, people are watching us.
Klaus Krogh Madsen asks, why not choose a closer serial relative, for example, from Cicale or Hordeum? Why intermediate wheatgrass?
Yeah, so we've also worked on some of those. I think we have a diverse approach of trying a bunch of approaches in parallel, and we'll see which one works out the best. Hordeum we've had a hard time finding hordeums that are perennial in our environment. There are some perennial hordeums. Same thing with Cicale. I've worked on Cicale montanum, which is a perennial that's crossable with Cicale cereale, but again, it was kind of marginally perennial in our location. And so we haven't pursued the perennial rye approach, but other researchers have. There's been a fair bit of work in Germany going back ways in history on perennial rye, and those lines were introduced kind of around the world, and people picked them up. I haven't. It was something I tried. My first few years at the Land Institute, I worked on at least 7 different species, and this one had a lot of things going for it, and that's why I've pursued it. A lot of it's just the ease of growing and culturing it in our environment, really well adapted and broadly adapted, vigorous plant that, it's the approach of trying to make something that's already has a lot of the features you want and introduce grain features into that versus taking a grain that's really good and trying to get some perenniality into it. I should mention that our most successful perennial grain crop is perennial rice right now. So that was a project started at Erie in the late or middle 90s, then brought back to China, and been working on it in Yunnan province of China. We've supported that for many years now. Now there's thousands of hectares of perennial rice grown in China, and the yields are about the same as annual rice, and they've taken 6 cuttings, 6 harvests from that field and not seen a decline in the stand. So, and that's with a very small introgression of perenniality genes from the perennial relative of rice. So a great project. Those introgression projects tend to be a little bit higher risk, so you're not sure if you're making progress. You might work for decades and really have nothing to show for whether you're making it, and then suddenly you finally get everything coming together. And so we have definitely a perennial wheat project at the Land Institute. We're trying to make wheat through introgression from wild perennials, and sorghum, the same thing. In Africa is the best fit right now, but also in temperate zones.
Okay, so I think I have two related questions. So one again, you said it was you said in the beginning that it was first you made a survey of 100 grasses, yes,
Yep.
to find the best one, and I think half of all grasses are perennial. I mean, it's species, so it's a fantastic idea to domesticate a perennial grass, but why choose then an allohexaploid? Aren't there diploid grasses that you could more easily domesticate?
Yeah, so if you're just looking at breeding, it doesn't really matter as much whether you have a hexaploid or a diploid. If you start wanting to do genetic stuff, then it gets a lot easier to work with on diploids. I've evaluated many of these lower ploidy grasses in our environment, and they're all extremely weak. So for some reason, the diploids just are quite weak, and many of them not really persisting very well in our location. I imagine some places in the world they do a lot better, but the hexaploids tend to be much larger, more vigorous plants, and that's why we've worked with them. When it comes to introgression, we've also had this. We've assumed that you should be able to just work with the diploid, bring the whole diploid genome into wheat, and you kind of have an instant perennial wheat, but that's also not worked well for us. So we've gone to introgressing from the hexaploid instead.
So again, related to the other question is, how many genes would you need to make it perennial? I mean, what is the feeling now?
Yeah, that's what
you said a few genes.
That's why I mentioned the rice, because if you're in a tropical environment and you have lots of water and everything, and all you got to do is not die. In this case, in rice, basically it makes a very, very short rhizome, and all you have to do is initiate that very small rhizome to grow. That's quite doable. As you get into a temperate environment where you have to sense the oncoming of winter and dormancy and regrowing, and then winter hardiness, and as well, I think there's a lot of disease resistance is important. So if we just take an annual crop and make it not die, and it doesn't have any more resistance than annual crops currently have, it's going to be really susceptible to diseases. So perennials have great resistance in general because they've had to sit in one place for hundreds of years at a time and just take whatever comes along, so they're pretty resistant. Annuals have been escaping as their evolutionary strategy. So instead of having great resistance, they just die here and live somewhere else. That fits into our grain production rotation model pretty well. So I think with perennial grains, we're going to have a really durable disease resistance. So I think numerous genes, I don't know, dozens, hundreds. And that's why I think this domestication of wild perennials is a good approach, because we know domestication can be done with relatively low numbers of genes, whereas I think a really good perennial takes more genes.
So, Henrik, take.
So I saw your breads, your baking experiments for that. So have you looked on the storage protein profile and
Yes.
amino acid composition and so
Yes, yes. So we've looked at sort of a general profile of all the nutrients, and it's quite similar to wheat in general. There's a few vitamins that are much higher in the intermediate wheatgrass. The protein content is relatively high, so around 20%. But that doesn't mean it's good bread baking proteins. They're just proteins.
but I guess it's low in starch.
And then high in fiber and low in starch. So
that's
things that need a lot of starch, like a cake, we found if we add some starch from potato starch or something, we can get it to work well.
But how does it respond to nitrogen? Is it just becoming taller, or do you?
Yes, so nitrogen management is really important. we find that it's very touchy. So too low of nitrogen, we get very low yields, and too high of nitrogen, we'll get very tall and lodging. And so in most situations, we found that if we have a good soil and it was annually cropped before, the first year you should probably put on no nitrogen at all. The second year, about 70 kilograms per hectare is about right. So a little bit lower than annual crops.
And I guess you have looked for dwarf genes already.
Yeah, we're having a hard time finding dwarf genes. So that's actually why this introgression thing I've started working on, trying to get some dwarfing genes from wheat. But also a genome editing approach might help us get there too. We definitely find a lot of QTLs for height, so that might help us. But in general, the higher the grain yielding plant it is, the taller it is. It's a kind of an overall vigor thing going on there, I think.
So like wheat before the dwarf genes.
Yeah, so these are, the best plants tend to be about 1.2 meters.
Yes, thank you.
So I have a question. So if half of all grasses are perennials, then it's striking that all our grain crops are annuals.
Yeah.
Is there any reason why our ancestors chose to domesticate annual grain crops?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky question. I think we've written about 3 papers trying to answer that question. But I'll give you the kind of the back of the envelope or a quick summary, I think, of what we think about this. Basically, perennial plants were harvested alongside annuals by our ancestors, but perennial plant you just walk up to and cut it every year. There's no regrowth or planting involved and reestablishment, so that those populations wouldn't evolve. They would basically stay the way they were. Whereas if an annual that's always reseeding, if you start cutting and accidentally propagating them, you get kind of accidental domestication happening because you're going through cycles of selection and replanting almost by default. I think the interesting comparison would be towards tree crops. So we domesticated trees that are perennials, but we never domesticated grasses that are perennials. And I think the deal going on there is that we figured out how to make cuttings of trees, and you could just lop off a piece and stick it in the ground or graft it, and that's a fairly big organism. So a few cuttings gets you a lot of production. Whereas if you're going to start cloning, we didn't have the tools to start hacking into the ground and digging up clones of perennial grasses and propagating them. So we had to, it just never happened for that reason. It's kind of only now that once we have a civilization that we understand the relationship between perennials and roots and soil that we can realize, it would be a lot better to have a different kind of plant. But you couldn't get to that point of that realization without civilizations developing, which depended upon annual grains. So it's kind of this interesting pathway. You have to go through the annual grains, but eventually you should make a switch toward perennial systems for your civilization to be sustainable. Is sort of our perspective on that.
Thank you very much. So more questions? Questions from the virtual audience? You're most welcome to text in during this session.